We shall commence this module by discussing about the market and the government. The market and the government are the two elements of an economic system. The individuals and institutions that are the owners of the resources regulate the markets. Market is a system that coordinates the production and consumption of goods and services through a price mechanism. The transactions between the market participants are voluntary and are targeted to maximize the individual objective functions. The classical school of thought had strongly argued for a price mechanism that without government intervention would ensure full employment through free play market forces. Now the question arises, if a price system is efficient, what role is there for the government policy? It is important to remember that efficiency is not the only criteria by which an economic system may be judged. Since the 1930s, there has been a profound change in the way a government works. Apart from performing political and social activities, the government are expected to look into the economic matters and ensures the economic stability. In addition, a price system itself requires certain governmental actions. For the purpose, government uses many policy instruments and allocates resources and redistributes income. A case can clearly be made for government to redistribute income in the interest of equity. The chapter highlights the role of government in an organized society, and different perceptions of the role of the government have evolved over time. After studying this module, you shall be able to understand the role and functions of government in an organized society, know how economic perceptions regarding the role of government have evolved over time, what role should the government play in the economy relative to the markets? What a service should it provide and how should they be financed? Over the period of time, government's role in an economy has been redefined. In some countries such as Norway, Sweden, Finland, etc., governments are expected to provide a wide range of services, and in countries such as Sudan, Chad, and Somalia, governments have lost control. The field of public finance answers these questions. As a field of economics, it is concerned with the financial activities of the government. Musgrave describes public finance as the complex of problems that center around the revenue expenditure process of government, is referred to traditionally as public finance. In other words, the study is concerned with the method of raising government financing and the mode of spending them. This in turn is dependent upon the objectives of the government. Despite many countries being market economies, the government across the country and around the world play a dominant role in the society because markets do not efficiently allocate all or even nearly all of the output the country produces. The government is involved in affecting the way income is produced and allocated. Musgrave identified two distinctions between the analysis of role played by the government, normative and positive. The normative analysis looks into the way the things ought to be, that is, what government should do in order to correct the market imperfections and in order to maximize social economic welfare, whereas the positive analysis is concerned with what government actually does. For example, a positive analysis of poverty data of a country reflects 20% poverty rate. In a normative sense, however, we would be interested to know whether the poverty rate is too high. The study of public taxation and expenditure structure falls under the realm of positive analysis, that is, actual behavior. The study of financial activities of the government according to the desired goals will fall into the normative analysis of the public finance, that is desired behavior. In the ideal case, the two roles merge because the government would be carrying out its activities as desired. However, in the real world, the two roles tend to diverge. The divergence can be attributed to many reasons, such as the difference between the interest of various parties, for example, public interest and the government interest. Apart from it, rent seeking and corruption, misconceptions on the part of policymakers, influence of the past programs and policies of the past governments, inadequate knowledge and expertise of policymakers, etc., exert considerable influence on government activities. Thus, the task is to minimize the divergence between the actual behavior of the government and the desired one so as to achieve the maximum social economic welfare. The field of public economics attempts to analyze why government behaves as it does during the decision making process, how that government behavior provides economic incentives for the private firms and individuals to change their behavior, and what the impact is of those changes on the economic welfare of the firms and individual. The issues of public revenue and expenditures are a subset of larger objective of the government. Keynes pointed out that the government problem of mankind is to combine three things: economic efficiency, social justice and individual liberty. The government across nations try to achieve the goals of economic efficiency and equity through an appropriate design of public sector programs and financing. Apart from ensuring internal and external security, provision of infrastructure and public utilities are the main functions of the government. In countries such as the former Soviet Union, paternalistic government policies were adopted where resources were under the government control. In some countries, the government also influences the resource allocation through a system of incentives and directives. In market-oriented economies such as the US, market failure also necessitates the government intervention in resource allocation, as achievement of an efficient resource allocation and market correction requires well-designed property rights and enforcement of contracts. And still, another government role can be rationalized because of the existence of public goods and externalities. There is a strong case of government intervention in resource allocation in low-income countries. These countries are characterized with low levels of savings and investment, scarcity of skilled labor, underdeveloped factor and product market, and a virtual absence of an entrepreneurial class. These countries also have highly skewed income distribution, and therefore the allocation of resources catering to the prevailing demand pattern of the society would only result in the allocation of scarce resources in favor of the high income communities. Let us understand the essential and necessary roles of the government through a historic perspective and how different perspectives have evolved over time. Government role in the 18th and 19th century. If one looks into the history, one can find that government came into existence for the purpose of protecting the communities. Thus, its scope was limited and narrow. The 18th century mercantilists were advocates of government role in promotion of trade and industry. Their aim was to maintain a reasonable balance of trade through an adequate stock of gold and silver by playing a protectionist role in the economy and encouraging exports and discouraging imports, especially through the use of tariffs. In response to them, Adam Smith in his Wealth of Nations 1776 argued for the limited role of government. Accordingly, there exists an invisible hand in the economy that would ensure full employment through the operation of market forces, and thus there is no need for the government intervention in economic activities. It was further pointed that the profit motive would lead individuals to interact with each other, and only those firms that would supply the products demanded at the lowest price would be able to survive. The persuasion of the private interest would serve the public interest. He pointed out that government has three fundamental duties to perform. First, national defense, protecting the society from the violence and invasion of the other independent societies. Second is the maintenance of law and order or administration of justice, that is protecting as far as possible every member of the society from the injustice or operation of every other member of it, or the duty of establishing an exact administration of justice. And third is the provision of public good, that is erecting and maintaining those public institutions and those public works which, though they may be in the highest degree advantageous to a great society, are however of such a nature that the profit could never repay the expense to any individual or small number of individual, and which it therefore cannot be expected that any individual or small number of individuals should erect or maintain. Adam Smith's view influenced the classical economist who advocated the doctrine of laissez-faire, a market-oriented economic system with no government intervention. John Stuart Mill argued that government should not control the private enterprises. In his words, the best of all plans of finance is to spend little, and best of all taxes is that which is the least in amount. Laissez-faire should be the general practice. Every departure from it, unless required by some great good, is a certain evil. Since the individuals try to maximize their income, total national income would also be maximized in the process. The governments should aim to protect the economic and political liberties of the individuals and guarantee the property rights and ensure enforcement of contracts. As a consequence, the economic role of the government during this period was limited, and public expenditure constituted hardly 10% of the GDP. To meet the expenditure associated with the above three duties of the government, Adam Smith laid out four canons of taxation: canon of equality, canon of convenience, canon of economy, and canon of certainty. The classicist argued that taxes hinder private initiatives and restrict the resources available to the private sector. Government role in the 20th century. However, there was a gradual change in the concept of state, and its scope steadily increased. With a rise in income inequalities and unemployment, there was a gradual change in the thinking of 19th century economists and policy makers. These evils were attributed to the private ownership of capital. The Great Depression saw the rise of Keynesian school of thought, who advocated an active role of the government in the economic sphere. It became a driving force of the economic decision making in the 20th century. In 1929, unemployment reached a peak of 25%, and it was widely argued that markets had failed and there was increasing pressure for the government intervention to curb the economic downfall. Keynes forcefully argued in favor of an economic role of the government in saving the economy through effecting the rise of effective demand. He demonstrated that fiscal activities of the government could raise the employment and maintain it at a high level. He introduced the concept of compensatory finance, whereby government expenditure is augmented to compensate for the decline of the private expenditure. The Depression brought many other problems in the forefront. Stock markets had crashed, banks failed, poverty and unemployment rose along with deflation. The US government took active steps to stabilize the economy and introduced many programs under the New Deal program to alleviate the problem of unemployment, social security, insurance, and a host of other social economic problems. Post-World War II period witnessed high periods of economic growth. However, it was accompanied with high levels of poverty and inequality. This provided an impetus for the further government intervention, and more programs were announced targeted to education, health, employment and social security sectors. By the 1950s, government across countries had assumed a greater role from protecting the country from aggressive and war to a wider role of a welfare state with the objective of achieving maximum social welfare. There was a large expansion in the role of government. Public spending as a percentage of GDP increased from 12% in 1913 to 45% in 1995. Since then, the government has assumed greater importance in affecting the economic activities. They play an even more critical role in the development of less developed and developing countries. Both political ideological factors have contributed to the rise of the government activities. So far, the classical economists had focused their attention on the allocative function of the government, but gradually Marxist and socialist thinking took over and government started playing significant distributive functions in market economies. The rise of centrally planned economies of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe economies saw a gradual movement of many economies towards mixed economy system. The mixed economies involve a larger role of the government with income redistribution and equity, poverty reduction and economic stabilization as main policy objectives. Countries with larger public sector were seen as less prone to the fluctuations in the business cycle. Public spending on education and health, progressive taxation, subsidies, welfare schemes, etc. were the common government programs, and public enterprises were used for generating productive employment. Overall, Keynesian thinking and the technical development was used as a justification for expanded government sector. As discussed earlier, public goods and externalities became an important justification for the expanded government role. Public provision of some goods was justified on the grounds that market would undersupply such goods, and in the case of externalities, it was expected that government would increase the private cost of production and consumption of goods with negative externalities and decrease the cost of goods with the positive externalities. Another argument put forward for greater public sector role was that the private sector lacked the managerial skills that were available with the public sector. In some cases, large capital requirement, information essential and long gestation period justified the public investment. Thus, the period after the 1950s witnessed expanded role of the government in economic decision making, especially in the developing countries. The ideology that the governments are the best judge and have more knowledge than the private sector on how an economy operates and what public desires was the key factor guiding the government policy formulation and execution. Moving on to discuss the functions of the government. Musgrave, in his theory of public finance, has summarized the three essential economic functions of the government: allocation, distribution and stabilization functions. The resources are allocated through the market mechanism. However, in the case of market failure, when market fail to achieve microeconomic efficient allocation of resources, the government is required to intervene to guide, correct and supplement the market to achieve the desired outcome. There are 6 cases where market fail to achieve the efficient outcome: incomplete information, incomplete markets, public goods, externalities, macroeconomic imbalances and failure of competition. First is allocation function. Public goods are a classic case of a market failure. Markets fail to supply public goods. Such goods are collectively desired, whereas the need for the private good is felt individually. The markets can efficiently and optimally provide the private goods where producers are guided by the consumer demands. However, in case of the public goods, the properties of non-exclusion and non-rivalry make the market exchange operation inefficient. And it would be inefficient to exclude anyone from partaking the benefits from the consumption of a public good. From here arises the problem of free rider. Non-exclusion implies that people can refrain from making payment for the use of the public good, assuming others are paying for it, and thus they can escape non-payment. The government, through the imposition of taxes, can easily solve the problem of the refusal of voluntary payment in case of the public goods. The government must judicially determine the amount of supply of these goods. Individuals may refrain from revealing their true preferences and government may resort to the voting process. Decision making through voting becomes a substitute of preference revelation and taxes becomes a method of collecting cost shares. Thus, an approximate efficient solution can be achieved through the government provision of public goods. Second is the distribution function. The study of economics deals with an efficient utilization of scarce economic resources given the distribution of income and pattern of consumer preferences. Income distribution depends on the distribution of factor endowments that in turn is determined by the process of factor pricing. Under perfect competition, the factors receive a payment equals to the value of marginal product. However, under imperfect competition, factors receive less than the value of marginal product. Moreover, even if factor prices are determined under competitive setup, it does not guarantee a fair distribution of income. It is difficult to compare individual utilities derived from their income and moreover, redistribution policies involve considerable efficiency cost in the form of welfare losses associated with taxes and the change in consumer and producer surpluses. Thus, the question, what constitutes a fair distribution, is a difficult one. It is here where the government plays a critical role. Redistribution is implemented through tax redistribution, progressive taxation of high income groups and provision of subsidy for the low income group. Second, use of progressive taxation to finance the programs targeted to benefit low income groups. Third, combination of taxes on goods consumed largely by high income groups and subsidy on goods consumed largely by low income groups. Third is the stabilization function. The allocation and the distribution function of the government exerts significant influence on the macroeconomic variable of the country. The market functioning cannot ensure achievement of economic objectives such as high employment, price stability, sound balance of payment, along with the maximum social welfare. The government assumes a greater role in augmenting the market for the achievement of desired macroeconomic goals. Without proper policies, economy of any country is subject to wide economic fluctuations such as unemployment and inflation. The Great Depression is one important example in this context. It exposed the loopholes of the market system and exhibited the important role played by the government in revival of the global economy. In recent years, with the growth of globalization, countries are even more vulnerable to the market fluctuations. The recent US subprime crisis and the global economic downturn is prime example in this regard. It has exposed the loopholes and vulnerabilities of growing economic and financial international integration. The government plays an instrumental role in affecting the aggregate demand. the key parameter affecting the employment level and the price levels. Aggregate demand depends upon the income of the consumers, which in turn depends upon the factors such as present and past income, wealth of the consumers, etc. In any adverse event, government action through an expansionary or restrictive monetary and fiscal measures can restore the equilibrium conditions. Let us now summarize what we have discussed in this module. The market is a system that coordinates the production and consumption of goods and services through a price mechanism. The government is an organization that uses coercive forces to coordinate people's activities according to set rules and regulations. It takes the responsibility of the provision of goods and services that cannot be provided by the market, such as public goods, social security, etc. Public finance is a study that is concerned with the method of raising government finances and the mode of spending them. The classical economists were advocates of laissez-faire economy and proposed the limited role of the government. Government intervention was restricted to the areas of national defense, law and order, and provision and maintenance of administration and public work. The Keynesian school of thought advocated a greater role of the government in economic activities and pushed for the greater fiscal measures for promoting economic growth. Government intervention is required to improve the microeconomic efficiency by correcting a market failure. There are 6 types of market failures: imperfect information, incomplete markets, public goods, externalities, macroeconomic disturbances, and imperfect competition. The Great Depression of 1930s, the 2 world wars, and the rise of the command economies of the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe were important factors influencing the rise of the government activities across nations. Many free market economies such as the US gradually moved toward a mixed economy system with both market and government playing important role in economic activities. The government functions are classified in 3 categories: allocation function, distribution function, and stabilization function.